Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, Dr. Marcus de Freitas. Dr. Marcus is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, focusing on international law, international relations, and Brazil. He's currently a visiting professor of international law and international relations at China Foreign Affairs University in Beijing, China. Well, Dr. Marcus, and welcome back to the show.
It's always a pleasure, Will. Good to see you again.
Absolutely, Professor. Such an honor to have you on the program. Now, I do want to get started. Now, before we talk about Donald Trump's visit to China, I think it's crucial we need to talk about this ongoing economic and the political relationship between Brazil and U.S. at this moment. Now, recently, again, I'm sure you are familiar with the matter that the current president of Brazil, Lula, paid a short visit to the White House. Now, when Lula was questioned regarding this economic relationship between the two countries, this is what he said, and I quote, "My political disagreement with Donald Trump do not interfere with my relationship with him as a head of the state. What I want for him to treat Brazil with respect, understanding that I am the democratically elected president here," end quote. Dr. Marcus, from your perspective, we understand the relationship between Trump and Lula has been rather rocky. Post the trip to China, what do you make of this statement from Lula, and how do we know that Lula is ready, what we say, getting ready to deal with someone that who is in hot water, especially in the foreign policy side? Your thoughts?
I think that one of the good things of the Lula years has been an increased relationship with China. There's no doubt that this has been improving as he has led the process with Lula, then Dilma, then Lula again. But we had that period where President Bolsonaro was in, and it was a very negative period for the relationship initially, because President Bolsonaro was trying to rely on the President of the United States, President Trump, adopted some of the rhetoric of Trump, wanted to be known as the Trump of South America, and saw and contributed to the deterioration of the relationship. But of course, trade spoke louder, and trade somehow made the Brazilian elite come to its senses, despite being schizophrenic sometimes. But it brought the Brazilian, particularly the agricultural sector, to an understanding that it made no sense for us to have a poor relationship with China. And that somehow was essential for Bolsonaro to change the way he was handling the situation, even though the relationship was not as strong. When Lula comes back to office, the situation improves, and we have seen, an increased interest of China in Brazil and Brazil in China. And this is good. But it's important to emphasize, too, Will, that Brazil and China, not Brazil and China, but Brazil and the United States are competitors when it comes to the Chinese market. One of the purposes of President Trump's mission or visit to China was to restore many of the agreements and many of the purchases of agricultural products from the United States into China. I think at around between 15 and $20 billion in agricultural products. Well, the most relevant of them is certainly soybeans, which Brazil is a major supplier. Beef, also, Brazil competes with the United States. So it's an interesting thing because Brazil should not consider estrangement, a distancing from China based on the relationship with the United States, because Brazil and the United States are competitors. And China has been a very loyal customer to Brazil, And the partnership has improved a lot. When Lula says that he's talking to a democratically elected president, is because during the election between Bolsonaro and Lula, there was this allegation that the electoral machines were not working and they favored Lula and so on. So that was the reason Lula needed to emphasize and wanted to emphasize that, which is something that has been recognized to be true. That Lula was elected by the majority of the people because Bolsonaro didn't handle the pandemic well. But this is the issue. I think that the message somehow that Trump wanted to say and Lula wanted to say is that we have a good relationship. Now, if Trump wanted to say and use the visit to say that, he still has his hands on Brazil because Brazil is part of the Western Hemisphere, I think that is not the reality, and it shouldn't be the reality. And the conversation, one of the most important topics of the conversation was certainly the possibility of the United States exploiting rare earth minerals in Brazil and mining in Brazil, which is one of the things that Trump is trying to circumvent, the Chinese dominance of rare earth minerals and refinement and all this. But these are things that are going to, even though they may be negotiated now, until the whole process goes through and the licensing and all this will take years. So I think the relationship between China and Brazil is likely to grow. I think Brazil was one of the largest recipients of Chinese investment this year. And Brazil is very excited. Now, Brazilians are getting very excited to drive Chinese cars. So I only see, good and positive things, hoping that this agreement between the American government and the Chinese does not affect our countryside and our agricultural sector as much.
Well, Professor, again, there's no denying and there's no surprise. As you mentioned, the economic relationship between China and Brazil is going to be or continue to be much closer. But meanwhile, since you mentioned Donald Trump, let's talk about Donald Trump. I mean, since the first term of the Trump presidency and also the second term of presidency, despite this unpredictability of the person, but there's one thing is quite clear and consistent within the Trump administration is the word loyalty. I mean, we're looking at the domestic election. The primaries happened on Tuesday. And again, the message was quite clear that either the candidates or within the Republican Party were with Trump or without Trump, they were more likely to become the target or the sacrifice of the Republican Party. Now, with that said, again, I want to go back to Lula's another statement. And this is, again, what he said when it comes to the relationship with the U.S. He said, and I quote, "Those who bow their heads may not be able to raise them again. Brazil is very proud of what it is. We do not have to bow to anyone," end quote. Professor, from your perspective, again, Dr. Marcus, this is a strong message. Lula is not talking about just physically from this body gesture that bow to someone. Basically, if I understand it correctly, it's an indication about this political equality or this economic equality between the two countries or between the two head of the states. So from your perspective, what kind of message is that Lula says Brazil does not bow to anyone? So how do you think the reaction from the West, or how do you think that this message should be well interpreted today? Your thoughts?
Well, I think the message is clear, particularly to the Europeans, who have adopted a very vassal position in relation to the United States, also Japan. So, and one of the things that we have learned in the process of this presidency of Donald Trump, his second term, is that the countries that are closest to the United States are the ones that are suffering the biggest humiliation. Look into Canada, how he's been treating Canada. look at into this whole idea about Greenland, how he treated the Europeans, how he has applied taxes on the Europeans, and how he has told them that the Europeans have taken advantage of the United States in all possible ways, including NATO. And the Europeans, instead of resisting, they only were able to grow a spine when Greenland became an issue. But they were trying to appease Donald Trump every time. And what we have learned is that President Trump doesn't seem to have somebody or a country that could actually put some brakes on his action. That's why the Iran war has taken place. You know, that is an asymmetric war. It's a war by choice of the United States. It doesn't make any sense for the U.S. to go there, incentivized by Benjamin Netanyahu in the process. So what we saw throughout these months of the Trump presidency, this year and a half of the Trump presidency, is that he is basically trying to treat all countries as if they were vassals of the United States. And gladly, in a way, with the exception of India, many of the BRICS countries have adopted a different position and behavior. Russia, for obvious reasons, China, for obvious reasons, South Africa, the president of South Africa was humiliated in the White House in the meeting that they had. And Brazil, in order to avoid this, we see they didn't even allow to have a press conference in the White House, in the Oval Office, like they always do, just to prevent any possibility of anything like that happening. So in a way, I think that President Lula was trying to convey a message that, no matter the size of the country, sovereignty should always be respected. And I think that is something that you observe, for instance, in President Xi. At the same time that he's receiving the largest countries or the most important, the members of the P5, is also receiving Serbia and providing them the same kind of treatment as a sovereign state. And I think that's what we need to bring back to international relations, the sense of respect for each other in the international chessboard. And that's something that somehow President Trump has managed in a very poor way and has created challenges for the whole world.
Dr. Marcus, let's talk about, again, you mentioned international relations for a second. In addition to President Trump, I want to bring another person into our conversation, the sitting Secretary of the State, Marco Rubio. If I remember correctly, that Marco Rubio said numerous times, again, not just about China, not just about Brazil, and also Iran, but another crucial country that he went back and forth, Cuba. I mean, there was no denying that when Rubio was questioned regarding this economic sanctions or this economic interest under the Trump administration, that again, Marco Rubio mentioned during numerous occasions that Cuba or the Cubans must be liberated. In other words, with the help, with the possible interference, or say, however the political strategy we call it, that Cuba needs a chance to be better. And as a matter of fact, that President Trump even told the press that it says if the U.S. opens a negotiating table, not one based on imposition, Cuba will participate. So, Dr. Marcus, from your perspective, we know that the war between U.S. and Iran, it's not done. And the war in Ukraine is still, again, gaining more attention despite what President Trump posted on social media. But right now, Cuba needs a chance to be clean. Cubans need a chance to be liberated. Don't you think at this moment, that Trump has a lot more. So, in the saying we say, don't bite off more than you can chew, but he surely has already bitten off more than he can handle. But how come no one ever told him to say, you're going to stop? Because you are basically creating chaos or hot mess for the international relationships. So how do we assess that? Or what is your assessment for that?
Well, we know when wars start, but we do not know when they finish and how they finish. So Trump may be creating some problems that and some of them may outlast his presidency. Remember, Trump was the president or the candidate who affirmed that he was going to end the war in Ukraine in one day. Hasn't done that. And he has realized and said, the problem is that they hate each other. Well, the problem is that some issues are complicated to deal with, particularly depending on how the United States has supported the whole process. Because you have to remember, Trump is a one-term president. So whatever agreements he makes will not outlast him because, he is highly likely to become a lame duck president if the midterm elections do not go so well. And he will have a hard time governing. And whoever comes after him will certainly scratch many of the things that he's doing. Now, Rubio wants to be Trump's replacement. It's very clear that Trump is actually working on three options there: J.D. Vance, Peter Hegseth, and Marco Rubio. And Rubio has been trying to qualify himself. And of course, in order to inherit the MAGA movement, he has to behave in a way like Trump. And certainly the issue of Cuba is one that has been on the American mind for a long time. But we should never forget that the reason Cuba is in that situation is certainly because of the political mismanagement of the country, it is true, but also because of the sanctions that the country has suffered for decades. And it seems to be an approach and basically a procedure book in the U.S. administration to generate chaos, expect the population to act and to do something, and then through that action, believe that there will be a regime change. It seems to be the playbook of the United States, and they tried to do that in Iran, and they thought that they were going to solve the problems immediately, and they didn't. And now it's the same approach with Cuba. But Marco Rubio promised $100 million, which is nothing, considering the situation and the chaos that has been created by the oil embargo and this whole situation. So I think it'll be very difficult for the diaspora, the Cuban diaspora in the United States. It may seem that he's doing the right thing. But for those who are suffering this situation, it doesn't make them more friendly to Donald Trump. Same thing happened in Iran, right? Certainly the political regime in Iran has its challenges, but Trump is not making it more easy, more difficult for them to get out of power. So it seems to be the playbook, and it hasn't worked as he expected.
Well, Dr. Marcus, I have two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about Trump's visit to China. Again, despite how the media portrays or how the media has reported between the two leaders, again, it's one thing that we look at the image, but it's something else that we look at the body languages and also the unspoken messages between the two leaders. So, Dr. Marcus, from your perspective, because it seemed to be a heated debate regarding this result, some experts believe that Trump walked away with some kind of deal that made with the Chinese leader. But on the other hand, people believe that Trump walked away seemed to be disappointed about the short state visit. Regardless if the result was positive or negative, the question that we all want to know, or the question that we would love hear from you as an expert, is did Trump set the expectations are so high? So in other words, how much do you think that Trump this time visit China, it was not really about this personal relationship, but it was really more about this PR aspect. It's more about showing the world that US is willing or able to work with the US again. What do you say to that?
I believe, and many people will say that, the visit was not as successful as Trump wanted. But at the end of the day, the two largest countries, the two largest nations in the world, they need to be able to talk to each other. And for 9 years, no president of the United States had come to China. And the relationship has deteriorated. Gladly, the Chinese were helped by the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States that basically put an end to the tariff war that Trump was imposing on China and around the world. But I think that it is important that both nations talk to each other. Of course, President Trump is a man of grandiosity, right? He likes to make everything that he does the best, right? He wants to be unique. You see that by the number of times that he asked President Xi whether he had taken to the garden many other world leaders. He was trying to get a response that it was the first time that they did that. So he likes that thing, and he feels that he prizes, right? And he loves it. So I think President Xi gave him the necessary grandiosity that he wanted, but also everything came with an advice, meaning we need to work together to avoid a situation that can deteriorate our relationship. And what we need more than anything is stability. To secure stability, we're willing to buy some planes, we're willing to do certain things, sign some agreements. We're willing to do that. But that doesn't mean that you're going to get everything you want, because China cannot, pay for the Iranian war, because it wasn't China that created the whole situation, right? And it would be unfair for China to tell the Iranians not to use the Hormuz Strait to protect themselves, because that in a symmetric war, the Iranians strategically used and have been using Hormuz as a very important instrument for them to somehow put pressure on the United States. After all, I always say that to my students. Trump gave the Iranians a weapon much more effective than the atomic bomb, because the Iranians realized that they can have a major impact in the world just by controlling the Hormuz Strait. President Trump basically gave, the Iranians a weapon that they were not using, and he made it available to them. So it would be unfair for China to pay for the bill of the problems generated by the United States. And I think that President Xi is enough of a statesman to understand what he should do to improve the relationship. But at the end of the day, I think that the key word of everything was stability. And that was conveyed from beginning to end. And somehow that word may not be, politically and domestically and whatever President Trump says to the American public opinion. But if we keep the stability and things, if we keep waters a little bit calmer between China and the United States, I think the visit will have proven to be effective.
Well, Dr. Marcus, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, going back to the relationship between Lula and Trump. The final statement regarding the role of Brazil in Washington, and this is what Lula said, and I quote, China discovered and entered Latin America. But today, my trade with China is twice as large as my trade with the US. If the US wants to move to the front of the line, great. But it has to want to, end quote. Dr. Marcus, this is again another strong statement. It seemed to me that Lula is very much open to the idea that the sustainability of the two relationship between US and Brazil, it's geared to move forward or destined to move forward. But the phrase it says, if the US wants to move the front line, but it has to want to. So in other words, is Lula waiting for the move from Trump? Or what is Lula waiting for from Washington? Your final thoughts.
I believe that it's basically the status quo. It's not going to change. The United States is asking the whole world to invest in the U.S. That's what Trump has been telling everybody. We are the hottest country in the world. Everyone wants to invest in the United States. Everybody needs to invest in the United States. He wants the industry to go back to the U.S. It doesn't. So the only country that is willing to invest in Brazil is certainly China, and the relationship between Brazil and China has improved a lot. And I think this is the way it should go because we have a lot of synergies in working together. But what Trump is not Lula is telling President Trump that he should move towards making the United States the number one investor in Brazil and the number one trading partner of Brazil, which is not going to happen. So he's making a statement of something that is highly unlikely to happen because, first of all, Brazil would never be the top priority for the United States because we're not a threat to the hegemony of the United States. They have other places in the world where their interest is much larger. And now, in one of the areas where they want to concentrate their focus certainly is Asia, not Latin America. Even though they have said that he wants to restore the Monroe Doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine, if that restoration doesn't come with the money and the dollars and the transfer funds and technology and companies, this is not going to change the current wave and the current situation. So Lula was just saying that, if the United States wants to become number one, we would be considering the possibility of, increasing our relationship. But it's unlikely to happen because, remember, Brazil and the United States are competitors in many areas when it comes to producing and selling to China. If Brazil decides to get out and move towards the United States, what are we going to do with the soybeans that are produced in Brazil? Sell them to the Americans? No. So it's highly unlikely to happen, but it made sense. It was a political statement saying, we want you to be number one, but, you have to invest, which is not going to happen.
Well, again, Dr. Marcus, it's strange to see how the direction of the international relationships are moving forward. But at the end of the day, as I mentioned many, many times, in this day and age, we don't need instability, but we need better strategies. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to talk to Dr. Marcus de Freitas. Again, Dr. Marcus is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. He focuses on international law, international relations. Well, again, Dr. Marcus, it's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for taking your time to join the show. And we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay closer attention to the global affairs. So thank you so much for doing this.